think the big thing about What the Bleep Do We Know is it's a great opportunity for people to begin to question the nature of reality, to begin to look at, what science has to say about the invisible and how our thoughts and how our feelings have an effect on our world in many ways. And so since the movie, I've been traveling around the world quite a bit, lecturing about both the neuroscience of mind and the principles of quantum physics about getting what you want in your life. Anybody who says that they understand quantum physics completely is a liar, because it's a concept that defies predictability. So you have Newtonian laws, which are classical physics that have to do with cause and effect, that are predictable mathematical equations that help us to understand how the principles of the universe work, kind of like a machine. That allows mind and matter to be separate entities. Well, with the advent of quantum physics, we're starting to see that mind is matter, and matter is mind, and that the two are inextricably combined. So that means then the way you perceive life, or the way you view the nature of reality, has effects. And so when I talk about the quantum model, what I'm really saying is that there's an unseen world of infinite possibilities that we have access to, but we continuously live in the same reality over and over again because we keep thinking the same way, we keep behaving the same way, we keep emotionally embracing the same feelings over and over again, and that allows us to stay in a very predictable outcome. Chiropractic is one of the original alternative health techniques, and chiropractors understand the principles of quantum physics, and they understand the principles of health not from a mechanistic standpoint, but from a vitalistic standpoint. And I always tell the chiropractic profession, you can't talk about innate intelligence, you can't talk about a power within that heals the body and then not ask it to work through you or interact with it on every single moment with every single patient. That this intelligence that we call innate intelligence is both personal and at the same time universal. And that when we begin to get out of the way, when we begin to change something about ourselves, and we begin to interact with this intelligence, we take it to a next level. And that's really the name of the game. Chiropractic has a very vitalistic view about health. It basically says that the power that made the body heals the body, that there is an innate intelligence within every human being that gives us life, and that intelligence has a certain ability to heal. And so I started studying spontaneous remissions back in the mid-90s and began traveling to different countries to find out how people were diagnosed with very serious conditions, and over a period of time they got better. And so when I correlated enough information with some of the results, I actually had to go back to school and get a great degree in neuroscience to begin to understand how mind was an element in it. And so when I saw that they changed their mind, that was the main element that produced the biggest changes in their health, I wanted to discover, understand what is mind, what is consciousness, and what is brain, and how do they work. And so that began my exploration into this idea. And there isn't, you can't actually describe healing at this point in our understanding without a quantum model of understanding. Well, neuroscience is the study, pretty much, of how the brain and mind work. And in the last 20 years, neuroscience has taken a quantum leap in their theories and understandings, because neuroscience now uses functional imagery. And whenever you use functional imagery, what you're seeing is you're seeing a brain in action. You're seeing a motion picture of a brain. So the difference between 30 years ago, if you had a problem with your brain, or you had a problem with depression, or you had a problem with a head injury or a stroke, the typical procedure was to take a snapshot of the brain, take an MRI or a CAT scan. That's a picture in 1 second of time. Functional imagery is studying a series of moments. You're seeing a motion picture of the brain, and whenever you see the brain in action or the brain at work, that's called mind. Mind is the brain in action. So because we can study different patterns or different specific signatures, it gives us a lot of information about the inner workings of the brain and mind. A lot of people want to understand how their brain is evolving. Well, every time you learn something new, you make a new synaptic connection in your brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new connections. Remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. The other way we make really valuable connections in our brain is through experience. When we have a novel experience, when we have something new happen to us, gangs of neurons organize themselves to reflect the external event. Now, of course, that begs the question for most people, how many things are you learning and how many new experiences are you having? And if you're not learning anything new, or if you're not having any new experiences, well, then your brain pretty much stays status quo. The biggest way we maximize brain potential is through the concept of focus or concentration. We have a new piece of machinery in the brain called the frontal lobe. It's 40% of our entire brain. And the frontal lobe actually is what separates us from all other species. It's not the fact that we have opposing thumbs or we stand on 2 feet, that our eyes point straight ahead, or we have a big brain. Elephants have bigger brains than us. What makes us so unique is the size of the frontal lobe in reference to the rest of the brain. Now, the frontal lobe is the CEO. It's the symphony leader. It's the boss. It's where our conscience resides. It's what allows us to observe our actions, observe our thoughts, pay attention to our feelings, and then decide on how we're going to change who we are to do a better job in life. And so when we begin to use our forebrain in the proper way, we're inventing new possibilities. We're speculating new outcomes. We're paying attention by learning. And when we begin to pay attention, the practice and art of paying attention allows the brain to move into more synchrony, into more balance, into more coherence. And so the opposition to that creative state is living in a state of survival or living in a state of stress. And when we live in stress, the exact opposite happens. We have the hindbrain now directing the forebrain, and we live primarily by the emotions of the body. And that's when people begin to develop diseases or begin to develop anxiety and depression, because it's the chemicals of stress that knock the body out of balance as well as the brain. Well, it's nothing wrong with having a stress response. We all react to the external world. The stress response is when your body is knocked out of balance and what it does to return back to order. And most organisms in nature are designed for short-term stress. It's when we start to have the long-term stresses. In other words, we have a series of stressors and where the body can't return back to balance. When that happens, where the body can't recalibrate itself back to order, now we're headed for disease. So the most difficult thing for people is to make time for themselves. If you were to make time and break the stress response, whether it is playing music, going for a walk, hiking, meditation, yoga, breathing, anything that's going to interrupt the stress response, sleeping allows the body to return back to order. So what makes us so unique is that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. And most people do it all day long. They begin to think about an event. They begin to anticipate something happening. They begin to forecast an idea, and as they begin to think about it, they begin to turn on the stress response, and the body thinks it's in that experience. And now we're headed for an imbalance. So some of the ways that people can turn off the stress response is being able to interrupt it by yoga or exercise or meditation or breathing, anything that's going to cause the body to go from a state of emergency to a state of growth and repair. And when we move to those states where the body has a chance to reorganize itself, that's when people start to notice that their anxiety is diminished, or their stress levels change, or their heart rate variability tends to move back to balance. And so I think the most difficult part of it all is making the time to do it. When we begin to talk about technology in the brain, there are limits to multitasking. And what we're beginning to realize from computerized technology, especially things like video gaming or even where you're checking your emails, that when people become so focused on the screen in front of them and attempting to get more done in a shorter amount of time, every time they click through an email or they're playing a video game and they overcome an obstacle, there's a release of dopamine in the brain. And the dopamine is the pleasure chemical in the central nervous system. And what happens is that if you begin to keep turning on those dopamine levels, the excess dopamine begins to change or recalibrate the pleasure centers to a higher level, which means the next time you play the video game or the next time you surf the net, you got to do it a little bit longer or change it a little bit more to get the same rush as you did before. Now, that sounds like an addiction to me. And what the problem is that when you start taking the person out of that type of bombardment or that stimulation, and you tell them, let's go for a hike, or let's go watch the sunset, or let's, take your grandmother for a walk, or go play with the dog, you don't get any pleasure from that because your pleasure centers have been changed to a higher level. And that's when people start to become addicted, and they start to try to find other means to start to calm down their stress levels. And now we're headed for big problems. So technology in itself is a forerunner for great opportunity. But what it does to the nervous system if we overdo it is just like any addiction. We start hijacking our brain to different chemical states. I think that some of the resurgence in the research that's being done on psychedelic drugs is really pointing the finger at, first of all, what's possible in the human mind and human brain, questioning the nature of reality, and then primarily, what is happiness? And so I think that when people are beginning to, some of the researchers that are beginning to look into this are taking research subjects that are healthy people that have never really done psychedelics or drugs before, and seeing, by comparing them to a placebo group, if the experiences alter their sense of perception and sense of self. And the recent research that was done at Johns Hopkins absolutely shows that people that have been guided and prepared properly have some really positive effects. And I think the big thing about that is it's starting to help people begin to see that happiness really comes from within. It doesn't come from the sports car, or the boat, or the vacation, or joining the golf club or the social club. It really comes from a state of inner peace and inner balance. And I think everybody at their deepest level wants to have a sense of joy or a sense of happiness. When we begin to rely on drugs as a means to interact consistently with the nature of reality, I think the redundancy of that over time begins to alter brain chemistry, and people wind up in trouble. If people use drugs to run away from their problems, just like alcohol, of course, they're going to wind up becoming addicted to it because there's some emotion that they're running from that they haven't confronted, and that drug or that alcohol or that chemistry, for a momentary period of time, makes that feeling of emptiness or the feeling of unworthiness go away. I think the most important thing for people to realize is that when we begin to make personal changes, when we begin to ask big questions like, what would it be like to be happy? What would I have to change about myself to live in joy? Who in history do I admire, do I want to be like? When do I fall from grace? And why do I live by the same emotion every day? As we start to ask these bigger questions and we get about the business of change, when we break through on a personal level, then we don't really rely on anything outside of us to bring us joy. It's coming from within us. And I think that's really what most people are looking for at this day and age in history. When we talk about the connection between science and spirituality, I think science is the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science is the contemporary language of spirituality. Because when we look at old texts that are 2,000 or 5,000 years old, we're studying those mystical teachers in the language of the time. And it doesn't translate to the present. And so as we begin to explore the nature of reality through science, everything from quantum physics to neuroscience to genetics to the cell to biology, we're beginning to understand how magnificent we really are. And so science is closing the gap between mind and matter, and hopefully over time we'll begin to see that the true understandings of spirituality will have a scientific basis. Many of the models are beginning to break down. The religious model, some of the scientific model, the medical model, the environment, the political model, the economic model, everything is beginning to fall apart right now, and I think it's a time where information really is the most accessible. And because of that, people are beginning to become empowered with their own sense of destiny and having the ability to make some personal choices. So I think religion is one of the ways that people, in an attempt to stay connected to a divine source, and it has there's some validity to it, but not all religions are spiritual, and not all spirituality equals religion. So I think there's a divergence at a certain point. Well, I travel about a little over 200 days a year and travel to different parts of the world talking about really human potential, teaching people that the way they think and feel has a direct effect on their life, that they have a certain amount of control over their destiny. And the audiences are very enthusiastic and very inspired because, again, when we use science as a model to help people understand the invisible or understand the nature of reality, nobody's excluded from the equation because everybody begins to realize that we're all divine and that we're all creators, and that this idea of separatism and this idea of culture that creates divisions, I think that's all beginning to fall apart. Or there's a chosen group of people. Right now in our world, people want answers, and they want to know how they can have a better life and how they can find balance. And so everywhere I go, I have a really great reception. I think the information that I teach opens minds to a certain degree and begin to, if they don't even learn anything else, if people don't learn anything else, they understand, first of all, why it's so hard to change, what it means to truly change, how the mind and body are connected, and how we memorize certain patterns that keep us heading towards our genetic destiny. Once you begin to understand some of those elements, then the next question is, how can I reinvent a new self? How can I become somebody else? So the premise that I teach is very simple. Your personality creates your personal reality. So your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So the present reality that you're experiencing today is created from the present personality that's, sitting in front of me. That means then if you wanted to create a new personal reality, a new life, you would have to change the way you think, the way you behave, and the way you emote. And when people begin to make small modifications, even in those subtle things, they begin to make different choices, which leads them to new destiny. And that's quantum physics right there. So the title of the workshop this evening is called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And that is actually the name of my second book that we're putting out in the fall. What happens by the time we're 35 years old is that we memorize a set of automatic programs, a set of behaviors, a set of emotional propensities that really contribute to who we're being. And 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old sits in a subconscious program, a subconscious memory system, which we've practiced something so many times that now we don't have to think about it any longer. So the workshop this evening, or this talk this evening, is all about pointing the finger at why it's so difficult to change and what it means to change, and what it means to truly change, what it really truly means to begin to organize a new state of mind and body. And so it's about a 45-minute to an hour lecture, and then most of the great stuff happens when we do the Q&A. Well, my weekend workshops are an opportunity for people to retreat from their life. That if you believe that your thoughts have something to do with your destiny, that the way you think controls your life, then we would have to begin to examine how you react to your life. So if your environment is controlling your thinking, which means that you wake up and you do the same things, you see the same people, you drive to work the same way, you shave with the same hand, you drink coffee out of your favorite mug, you do the same exact thing every day. It's the environment, the external world, that's turning on different circuits in your brain to cause you to think equal to your environment. And because you recognize familiar known things, you'll keep creating more of the same. So the workshops are about people retreating from their life for a weekend, for 2 days, for 3 days, to begin to think independent of the environment, to begin to wire information into their brain and maintain and sustain that information so that they can begin to create a new life. And then as they begin to change their way their brain works and recondition their body to a new mind, to reinvent a new self, and memorize that internal order so that nothing from their environment can move them from it. Now, it's no longer the environment having an effect on them. Now they're beginning to have an effect on their environment. So the workshops are all about making that switch. Well, the upcoming book is called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, How to Lose Your Mind and Create a New One. And after I wrote Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind, everybody said, great book, a lot of science, but can you tell us how to do it? So the second book is really the how-to. Most people wait for crisis or trauma or loss in their life to get about the business of change because they can't go on business as usual. The book is actually a sincere attempt to have people to begin to realize that we don't have to wait for crisis to change. We can change in a state of pain and suffering, or we can change in a state of joy and inspiration. And I usually like to choose the latter. So the book has a lot of science and a lot of some of the latest research on epigenetics and how we can change our internal workings. And then the second half of the book is the practical application on how to make those personal changes. We demystify meditation. We demystify some of the concepts that were taught in ancient cultures so that people have more understanding of what they're doing when they're in the process of change. Gosh darn it, I'm up to a whole lot of things these days. We're working on a new model for addiction, hopefully, to teach people that there's a better way to make transformative changes that are more permanent. I'm doing level 2 and level 3 workshops, taking people to the next level. We have a whole new series of CDs coming out. That one's called The Art of Change, the other one's called The Reinvention of Self, and on and on and on. And again, most of it is just getting the information out and hopefully creating it in a way that people can actually use it for themselves. I believe that there is absolutely a soul, and I believe that if you can change the brain and you can change the mind, it begs the question, who's doing the changing of the brain and the mind? The brain can't change the brain because it's just an organ. It's nothing different than a liver or a kidney. And the mind can't change the brain because the mind is the product of the brain. It's the brain in action. So when you begin to think about actual physical changes that are taking place in the brain and mind, there's only one thing that can do that, and that's that immaterial aspect of you and I that governs the brain and body to produce different levels of mind. And when we're truly conscious and we're truly aware, when we're truly paying attention, now we're no longer living, by our genetic destiny. Our genes then become the starting point in our life to fulfill a new destiny, to change something about ourselves. And when the soul begins to gain wisdom, when we begin to master something, that's another piece of the puzzle that the soul takes with it on this journey into infinity.